The rain was a cold, gray sheet, hammering the corrugated tin roof of the porch like 1,000 tiny fists. Elias Thorne watched it from the shadows, a ghost haunting the skeleton of his family's farm. The whiskey in his glass was the same amber as the dying light filtering through the skeletal branches of the oak tree in the yard. It tasted like ash and memory. He was a man made of scars. The jagged line that cut through his left eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline was a gift from a knife fight in a Kandahar bazaar. The slight, almost imperceptible limp in his right leg was a souvenir from the IED that had stolen his life. Not his breath, not his pulse, but his life. The man who had been Master Chief Petty Officer Thorne, callsign Ghost, was dead. He'd been killed in action alongside the rest of his SEAL team. This thing that remained, this hollowed-out shell of a man, was just the paperwork left behind. The farm was his last refuge, a graveyard of his family's failures that now served as the perfect tomb for his own. The paint peeled from the clapboard siding like sunburnt skin. The barn leaned at an angle that defied physics, but promised collapse. Every gust of wind through the broken window panes sounded like a sigh of resignation. It suited him. Here, in the heart of rural Pennsylvania's forgotten hills, his own decay felt like part of the landscape. He took a long swallow of the whiskey. The burn was a familiar friend, a dull warmth that did little to chase away the bone-deep cold that had settled in his soul on a dusty road in Helmand Province. The memory was always there, lurking just behind his eyes, the pressure wave, the world turning to fire and soundless screaming, the ringing in his ears that had never truly gone away. He remembered the weight of his best friend, David, falling against him. He remembered the smell of cordite and blood, a perfume he would wear for the rest of his days. They gave him a medal for his valor and a medical discharge for his wounds, both seen and unseen. They called him a hero. He felt like a fraud. A hero saves his team. He had been the only one to walk away, or rather be carried away. Survivor's guilt was a predator, and it had been stalking him for 2 long years, driving him further and further into the wilderness of his own mind. A piece of paper on the splintered kitchen table caught his eye. A brightly colored flyer, an obscenity in this monochrome world of grief. Clear the Shelters Day, it screamed in a cheerful font. Wakat, Sog Save a Life, Marianne, the local veterinarian, and the closest thing he had to a friend, had pressed it into his hand during his last reluctant trip into town for supplies. It's for charity, Eli, she'd said, her eyes full of a pity he couldn't stand. A promise is a promise. He'd made the promise to her brother David, his teammate, years ago. If anything happens to me, watch out for my sister. It was a soldier's pact, sealed in the face of 100 possible deaths. He had failed to save David, and now this was his penance. A charity dog walk. The absurdity was a bitter pill. A man who had hunted other men in the darkest corners of the world was being asked to walk a poodle for a good cause. He crumpled the flyer in his fist, the paper crackling in protest. He wanted to burn it, to let it turn to ash like everything else he touched. But the ghost of David's voice was there, in the back of his mind. A promise is a promise. He opened his hand, smoothed the wrinkled paper, and stared at it. Save a life, the phrase mocked him. He couldn't even save his own. But the thought of disappointing the memory of the only man who had ever truly understood him was a weight he couldn't bear. He finished the whiskey in one last, searing gulp, the glass hitting the wooden railing with a sharp crack. He would go. He would walk the damn dog. He would fulfill the promise. And then he would come back to his tomb and wait for the ghost to claim him for good. It was just one day. What could possibly happen? The shelter was a cacophony of hope and despair. The air was thick with the smell of bleach and a subtle, underlying scent of animal terror that Thorne recognized instantly. It was the same smell that clung to men before a mission, the sweat of fear and adrenaline. Families with laughing children moved from kennel to kennel, cooing at fluffy puppies and eager tail-wagging mutts. Thorne felt alien, a predator that had wandered into a petting zoo. He kept to the perimeter, his shoulders hunched, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn field jacket. He felt the curious glances of the other volunteers, their bright, optimistic smiles faltering as they took in his scarred face and the cold distance in his eyes. He was a storm cloud in their sunny afternoon. Marianne found him lingering by the water cooler. Ely, you came. Her relief was palpable. I wasn't sure you would. A promise is a promise, he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing, rusty from disuse. She handed him a leash and a clipboard. Just pick one, sign him out, and take him for a walk around the designated path. It's that simple. She pointed towards the main kennel runs, where dogs of every shape and size barked and yelped, desperate for a moment of freedom. He scanned the rows of hopeful faces, the wagging tails, the pleading eyes. None of them registered. They were just noise, a blur of frantic energy. He felt nothing. Then his gaze drifted to the very back, to a separate, isolated run, a place for the difficult cases, the forgotten ones. There, lying on the cold concrete floor, was a German shepherd. He was skeletally thin, his magnificent black and tan coat matted and dull. His head was down, resting on his paws, but his eyes were open, and they were staring into nothing. The 1,000-yard stare. Thorn had seen that look before, in the mirror, in the eyes of young soldiers who had seen too much, too soon. The dog didn't bark, he didn't whine, he just lay there, a statue of resignation. A small handwritten sign on his kennel door read, Kaiser Male, found as a stray, not good with people, experienced handler only. Thorn felt a pull, a flicker of something in the frozen landscape of his chest. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. He saw his own brokenness reflected in the animal's haunted eyes. He saw a fellow veteran, a soldier left behind on a different kind of battlefield. He walked past the happy yapping dogs, his boots making no sound on the concrete floor. He stopped in front of the shepherd's run. The dog's head lifted slowly, and for a second their eyes met. There was no fear in the dog's gaze, just a deep, weary intelligence. An assessment. The dog's ears twitched, tracking the sound of Thorn's breathing. I'll take this one, Thorn said, his voice resonating with a certainty that surprised even him. A younger shelter worker, a boy with a cheerful face that hadn't seen enough of the world to be sad, rushed over. Oh, sir, I wouldn't recommend that. That's Kaiser. He's difficult. He won't let anyone near him. Thorn didn't look at the boy. He kept his eyes on the dog. He unlatched the kennel door slowly, deliberately, without breaking eye contact with the shepherd. The dog didn't move, but a low growl rumbled in its chest, a sound like distant thunder. It was a warning, not a threat. It's all right, soldier, Thorn whispered. The words meant more for himself than the animal. I'm not going to hurt you. He crouched down, turning his body sideways, making himself smaller, less of a threat. It was a technique he'd learned for dealing with jumpy informants in hostile territory. He held out the back of his hand and waited. The seconds stretched into a minute. The joyful noise of the shelter faded into the background. There was only the man, the dog, and the space between them. Kaiser's head tilted. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. His nose twitched, sampling the air, reading Thorn's scent like a biography. He sniffed Thorn's outstretched hand, his wet nose cold against Thorn's scarred knuckles. Then, he gave a single tentative lick before retreating back to his spot. It was an acknowledgement. Permission granted. Thorn clipped the leash onto the dog's worn leather collar. We're going for a walk, he said, his voice soft. The shepherd Kaiser rose to his feet, unsteady but resolute, and followed him out of the kennel, leaving the noise and the pity behind. The path for the charity walk wound through a small patch of woods behind the shelter. It was designed for cheerful strolls, for families and their temporary canine companions. Thorn ignored it. He led Kaiser down a less traveled fork, a game trail that plunged deeper into the cool, quiet shadows of the forest. The dog walked beside him, not pulling on the leash, but matching his stride perfectly, his gait still showing the ghost of a powerful, disciplined rhythm. The silence between them was comfortable. For the first time in 2 years, Thorn didn't feel the need to fill the quiet with the noise of the television or the bottom of a bottle. Here, with this broken animal, the silence was a shared language. They were two ghosts, haunting the woods together. They walked for what felt like miles, the sounds of the shelter fading completely, replaced by the whisper of the wind in the pines and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Kaiser seemed to relax, the tension in his shoulders easing. He even allowed his nose to drift to the ground, taking in the rich, earthy smells of the forest, a shadow of the dog he was supposed to be. As they rounded a bend near a small gurgling creek, two figures stepped out from behind a thicket of rhododendron, blocking the path. They were locals, Thorn guessed, from the cheap jeans and faded band t-shirts. They were lean and wiry, with the kind of mean, pinched faces that came from a life of petty cruelties. One of them, a man with greasy hair and a tattoo of a spiderweb on his neck, grinned, revealing a row of stained teeth. Well, look what we got here. That's a nice dog you got there, old man. Thorn stopped. He felt Kaiser tense beside him, a low growl vibrating up the leash into his hand. He placed a hand on the dog's back. The fur was coarse, the body beneath it a trembling bundle of muscle and bone. He's not yours, Thorn said, his voice flat and cold as a riverstone. The second man, shorter but thicker, with a belligerent set to his jaw, took a step forward. That's where you're wrong. That's Fang. He ran off on us a few weeks back. We've been looking for him. We'll be taking him back now. Thorn's eyes flicked between the two men. He saw the way they looked at the dog, not with affection, but with a cold proprietary malice. He saw the fresh bruises on Kaiser's flank, half hidden by the matted fur. He saw the old, healed-over scars on his muzzle. These were the men who had put them there. A different kind of cold settled over Thorn. Not the dead, empty cold of grief, but the sharp, icy clarity of purpose. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since his last mission. Righteous anger. His name is Kaiser, Thorn said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a tone that had made hardened terrorists break. And you're not laying a hand on him. The man with the spiderweb tattoo laughed, a short, ugly bark. You in what army, Grandpa? He pulled a cheap pocket knife from his jeans, the blade flicking open with a menacing click. Just give us the dog. We don't want no trouble. Thorn didn't move. He didn't tense. His body remained relaxed, a predator preparing an ambush. He registered everything. The distance between them, 8 feet. The weapon. A 3-inch blade, held incorrectly. The terrain. Uneven ground, a creek to his left, dense woods to his right. The civilian in his head screamed to de-escalate, to call for help. The soldier, the ghost, saw only a threat to his asset, and the asset was the dog. Last chance, Thorn said. Walk away. The knife wielder lunged. It was a sloppy, telegraphed move. Thorn moved with an economy of violence that was terrifying in its efficiency. He sidestepped the clumsy thrust, his left hand clamping down on the man's wrist like a vice, twisting it in a way a wrist was not meant to bend. The man screamed as the bone gave way with a wet popping sound. The knife clattered to the ground. At the same instant, Thorn's right hand shot out, not a fist, but a rigid palm heel, striking the man at the base of his throat. It wasn't a killing blow, just a perfectly placed strike to the vagus nerve. The man's eyes rolled back in his head as he crumpled to the ground, gagging and gasping for air. The second man froze, his jaw hanging open in disbelief. He had expected a scuffle with an old man. He had not expected to witness a surgical takedown by a ghost. Thorn turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto the second thug. The cold fury in his gaze was absolute. He took one step forward. That was all it took. The man stumbled backward, tripped over his own feet, and scrambled away into the woods like a frightened rabbit, leaving his gasping friend behind. Silence descended again, broken only by the whimpering of the man on the ground and the babbling of the creek. Thorn looked down at his hands. They were steady. He felt a tremor run through him, but it wasn't fear. It was the hum of a machine that had been dormant for too long, suddenly roaring back to life. He felt a wet nose press against his hand. He looked down. Kaiser was looking up at him, his tail giving a single, hesitant wag. The fear was gone from the dog's eyes, replaced by something else. Trust. Respect. Thorn crouched and picked up the dropped knife, wiping the handle clean on a leaf before tossing it deep into the creek. He looked at the man still writhing on the ground. Tell your friends, Thorn said, his voice a low growl that mirrored the dog's, that this dog is under my protection now. If I ever see you near him again, you won't be walking away. He turned his back on the wreckage and walked away, the German shepherd trotting proudly at his side. He had come to the woods a ghost. He was walking out a guardian. The leash in his hand felt less like a restraint and more like a link, a connection to a new kind of mission. When Thorn returned to the shelter, he bypassed the cheerful chaos of the main area and went straight to the small office where Mary Annie was tallying donations. Kaiser padded silently behind him, a dark, watchful shadow. Mary Ann looked up, her smile ready. It faltered when she saw his face. Ellie, is everything okay? You were gone a long time. Her eyes dropped to the dog, then back to Thorn. And you have a cut on your knuckle. We ran into some trouble, Thorn said, omitting the details. The dog's previous owners. Her face hardened with a veterinarian's righteous anger towards abusers. The ones who dumped him? What did they do? They won't be bothering him again, Thorn said. The finality in his tone left no room for questions. He placed the leash on her desk. I need to take him. Take him? She asked, confused. The adoption paperwork takes days, background checks. Not adopt. Foster. For now? Thorn clarified. He can't stay here. They know where he is. He needs a safe place. I can provide that. Mary Annie looked from Thorn's grim, determined face to the magnificent, watchful dog standing at his side. Kaiser was no longer the broken, defeated animal she had seen cowering in the kennel. He stood tall, his head held high, a quiet confidence radiating from him. He was a different dog, and Thorn was a different man. The haunted, distant look was still there, but now it was overlaid with a sharp, focused intensity. The ghost had a purpose. The farm is isolated, Thorn continued. No one will find him there. I'll take care of him. She chewed her lip, the shelter's rulebook warring with her gut instinct. The rules were clear, but the evidence in front of her was clearer. This man and this dog had forged a bond in the woods, a bond of mutual protection. Okay, Eli, she said, making a decision. Okay. I'll list him as being transferred to a special foster program for behavioral rehabilitation. It'll buy you some time, but you have to bring him in for checkups, and for God's sake, be careful. An hour later, Kaiser was sitting in the passenger seat of Thorn's battered Ford pickup truck, looking out the window as the derelict farm came into view. He hadn't made a sound the entire ride, just sat there, a silent, stoic passenger. Back in the crumbling farmhouse, Thorn set out a bowl of fresh water, which the dog drank thirstily. He then set about cleaning the wounds he'd noticed earlier. He worked with the practiced, gentle hands of a former combat medic, murmuring softly to the dog. Just some cuts and scrapes, partner. We've both had worse. As he was cleaning a shallow gash on the dog's powerful neck, his fingers brushed against something hard and worn. The collar. It was old, thick leather, cracked and faded. Clearly not something the shelter had put on him. Thorn's fingers traced its length, and as he did, he felt it. A small, almost imperceptible lump stitched into the lining, right under the jaw. His training kicked in. A hidden pocket, a dead drop. He carefully worked the stitching loose with the tip of a small knife. Inside, nestled in a tiny oilskin pouch, was a micro SD card. It was a high-density, military-grade data chip. Thorn stared at it lying in the palm of his hand, a tiny black square that screamed trouble. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. This changed everything. The local thugs weren't just abusers trying to get their dog back. They were low-level retrievers, sent for the cargo, not the courier. He turned his attention back to the dog. "What secrets are you carrying, boy?" he murmured. He gently examined Kaiser's ears, and there it was. In the soft skin of the right ear, faded but still legible under the grime, was a tattoo. It wasn't a number, it was a symbol, a small, stylized trident, and beneath it the letters MWD SOCOM, Military Working Dog, Special Operations Command. A cold dread, colder than any grief, washed over Thorn. This wasn't just any military dog, this was one of theirs, a special operator's dog, a dog that had been through the same hell he had. And he was carrying encrypted data for a command that buried its secrets deeper than any grave. Kaiser was not a stray, he was a soldier, a missing one, and Thorn, by saving him, had just stepped back into the war he had tried so desperately to leave behind. He was no longer just a man fostering a dog. He was a civilian in possession of a classified military asset and the sensitive intelligence it carried. He was a target, and they would be coming. Night fell on the farm like a shroud. Thorn didn't bother with the lights. Darkness was an old friend, a cloak he wore better than skin. He sat in the dark, the data chip on the table in front of him, a loaded pistol beside it. Every creak of the old house was an approaching footstep. Every gust of wind was a whispered command. He knew he should destroy the chip, take the dog back, and disappear. It was the smart play, the civilian play. But when he looked at Kaiser, lying by the hearth as if he'd lived there his whole life, he saw more than just a dog. He saw a brother in arms. He saw a silent oath. You don't leave a man behind, ever. He couldn't access the chip himself, not without the proper readers and decryption keys. But he knew the chip's very existence was a flag. Trying to access it would be like tripping a digital wire. But doing nothing felt like a betrayal. He was caught in a tactical dilemma, with his life and the dog's on the line. The decision was made for him. It started with a sound, a single sharp crack, like a dry twig snapping under a heavy boot. It came from the direction of the old barn. A civilian would have dismissed it. Thorn heard it for what it was, a mistake. A professional's mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. Someone was out there, moving with practiced silence. But the night was too still, the ground too littered with debris. Kaiser's head lifted from his paws, a low, guttural growl rumbling deep in his chest. It wasn't the warning growl from the woods. This was different. This was a threat confirmation. Thorn scooped the data chip into his pocket and picked up his pistol, the gold-cold steel a familiar weight in his hand. He moved silently to the window, peering through a crack in the grimy pane. Two figures, clad in black tactical gear, were moving across the overgrown yard, using the shadows of the outbuildings for cover. They moved like professionals. Not thugs, not cops. They moved like him. "Contact front," Thorn whispered, the old jargon falling from his lips like a prayer. "Two hostiles advancing on our position." Kaiser was on his feet, hackles raised, standing beside Thorn's leg. He didn't bark. He was trained better than that. He just watched, his body coiled like a spring, waiting for a command. The war had come home. Thorn's mind went into overdrive, the years of rust and whiskey burning away in a flood of adrenaline. His decrepit farm was no longer a tomb. It was a battle space. He knew every inch of it, the weak floorboards in the hall, the loose stone in the fireplace that hid his old service rifle, the root cellar entrance hidden under the braided rug in the kitchen. "All right, partner," he said to Kaiser, his voice calm and steady. "Time to go to work." He moved through the house not as a resident, but as a guerrilla fighter. He doused the single lamp he'd left on. He propped the door ajar, creating a fatal funnel. He grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, an improvised weapon for a close encounter. The first man breached the back door with a silent, fluid motion, a suppressed pistol leading the way. He was good. He swept the kitchen with the muzzle of his weapon, his night vision goggles giving the world a green, ghostly glow. He didn't see Thorn, who was pressed into the deep shadows of the pantry. The second man followed him in, taking up a position to cover the hallway. A textbook entry. But they had made a critical error. They had accounted for the man. They hadn't accounted for the dog. Thorn gave a low, two-note whistle, a signal he hadn't used in years. It was the attack command for David's dog. He prayed Kaiser remembered. Kaiser exploded from the shadows. He was not a pet. He was a weapon system. 110 pounds of focused fury. He didn't go for the first man. He went for the second, the covering man, hitting him in the center of his chest with the force of a freight train. The man went down with a strangled cry, his rifle clattering on the floor as Kaiser's jaws locked onto his arm. The first man spun around, distracted for a fatal half-second. It was all Thorn needed. He lunged from the pantry, the heavy skillet swinging in a brutal arc. It connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening crunch of bone and metal. The man dropped like a stone, his night vision goggles shattering on the floor. The fight was over in less than 10 seconds. It was violent, savage, and brutally efficient. Thorn stood in the darkness, his chest heaving, the skillet still in his hand. The familiar, metallic taste of combat was in his mouth. Kaiser had released the other man, who was now moaning on the floor, clutching his mangled arm. The dog stood over him, a low growl his only command. Thorn knelt and checked the pulse of the man he'd hit. He was alive, but he wasn't getting up anytime soon. He quickly and expertly zip-tied both men's hands and feet using their own restraints. He pulled the comms from their ears and smashed them under his boot. He had neutralized the threat. But this was just a scout team. The main force would be coming. He looked at Kaiser, who was now licking a wound on his own leg. "Good boy," Thorn breathed, his hand shaking slightly as he rested it on the dog's head. "Good boy, Kaiser." He knew he was out of time and out of options. There was only one call he could make. One last desperate gamble. He pulled his phone, a cheap burner, from his pocket and found the number he had memorized but sworn he would never use. The number for his old commanding officer, now Colonel Jackson Wyatt at the Pentagon. He dialed the number. It rang twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered. "Wyatt!" Thorn took a breath. "Ghost is on the wire," he said, the old call sign feeling foreign on his tongue. "I'm declaring a broken arrow." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Broken arrow. A distress call of the highest order. A unit in danger of being overrun. A call that demanded an immediate, overwhelming response, no questions asked. "Elias?" Wyatt's voice was sharp, instantly alert. "Son, is that you? Where are you?" "No time, sir," Thorn said, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. "I've made contact with hostile forces. 2 tangos down. More inbound. I'm at the old farm. I have a package. An asset? MWD SOCOM. Jesus Christ, Eli," Wyatt breathed. He understood immediately. "Sit tight. Help is on the way. And Eli, stay alive." The line went dead. Thorn looked at the 2 unconscious mercenaries on his kitchen floor. He looked at the magnificent dog standing guard. He looked at the rifle he had pulled from its hiding place. Help was on the way. But the night was long, and he knew the next wave would be bigger. Just as he was dragging the second mercenary into the cellar, he heard the sound of a vehicle approaching, its engine cutting off down the road. It wasn't the roar of military helicopters. It was a single car. Too soon for the cavalry. Too quiet for the enemy. Headlights swept across the front of the house. A car door slammed. "Ellie?" a voice called out. "Ely, are you in there? I heard on the scanner. Something about a disturbance out here." It was Mary Ann. Thorn swore under his breath. He ran to the door, his pistol still in hand. "Mary Ann, get out of here. It's not safe," he yelled through the door, but it was too late. As she reached the porch, another set of headlights flooded the yard. A black, unmarked SUV screeched to a halt, and 4 more men in tactical gear piled out, fanning out to surround the house. They were better equipped, more heavily armed. This was the main force, and Mary Ann was caught in the middle of it. Thorn pulled her inside, slamming and bolting the door behind her. "Get down," he yelled, pushing her towards the relative safety of the main living area. Her eyes were wide with terror, taking in the scene. The darkened house, the man with the rifle, the low growl of the dog. "What is happening?" she stammered. "No time," Thornton said, peering through a slit in the curtains. "They're here for the dog." That was when Colonel Wyatt called back, this time on a secure satellite link that bypassed the local towers, his voice tinny but clear from the phone's speaker. "Ellie, talk to me. What's the asset's designation?" "Kaiser," Thorn said. His eyes locked on the figures moving outside. His handler was David. The silence on the line was profound. When Wyatt spoke again, his voice was heavy with a grief that spanned years. David wasn't killed in that IED blast with you, Eli. That was the cover story. He was on a deep cover op, embedded with a private military contractor called Ares Tactical. We believe they're smuggling advanced weapons tech. David got proof. He put it on a data chip. Thorn's blood ran cold. He looked at the chip he had placed on the mantle. Ares found out, Wyatt continued, his voice grim. They captured him, tortured him for the location of the chip. He never broke. They killed him, Eli. They murdered a United States soldier. Kaiser was his partner. He was there. He was the only witness. He escaped during the firefight, carrying the chip. Ares has been hunting him ever since, trying to retrieve the evidence and bury their crimes. That dog is carrying David's last will and testament. The pieces crashed into place in Thorn's mind, a mosaic of pain and betrayal. This wasn't just about a dog. This was about David. This was about justice. The grief he had carried for 2 years transformed into a white-hot rage. He wasn't just protecting a dog. He was honoring his fallen brother. He was finishing his last mission. "They're here, sir," Thorn said, his voice dangerously calm. "Ares is on my doorstep." "Hold them off, son," Wyatt commanded. "The QRF is 5 minutes out." 5 minutes. "Do not let them get that chip." A voice outside, amplified by a bullhorn, cut through the night. "Thorn, we know you're in there. We know you have our property. Send out the dog and the chip, and we'll let you and the woman live." Thorn looked at Mary Ann, who was huddled on the floor, her face pale. He looked at Kaiser, who stood beside him, a silent sentinel. He thought of David, of his laughter, of his sacrifice. He picked up his rifle. "That's not going to happen," he said to the night. Then he raised the rifle to his shoulder, took aim at the lead figure in the yard, and the war for David's legacy began. The farmhouse erupted in a storm of gunfire, the quiet of the countryside shattered by the sound of battle. 6 months later, the sun shone warmly on the Thorne family farm. The air was filled not with the scent of whiskey and decay, but with the smell of freshly cut lumber and blooming honeysuckle. The house stood proud, its broken windows replaced, its peeling paint covered with a fresh coat of white. The barn still leaned, but now it leaned with character, not desperation. Elias Thorne sat on the newly repaired porch steps, a cup of coffee in his hands. The scars were still there, on his face and in his soul, but they no longer defined him. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, watchful peace. He was no longer a ghost. He was a caretaker, a homesteader, a man at peace. A heavy weight settled against his leg. He looked down into the intelligent amber eyes of Kaiser. The dog was magnificent, his coat thick and glossy, his body powerful and whole. He nudged Thorne's hand with his head, demanding a scratch behind the ears. Thorne obliged, his fingers sinking into the thick fur. The evidence on the chip, combined with Colonel Wyatt's full-throated assault on the Pentagon's bureaucracy, had brought Ares Tactical to its knees. Their executives were facing treason charges. David's name had been cleared, and his true heroism was finally entered into the official record. The Quick Reaction Force had arrived in a storm of rotor wash and overwhelming firepower, just as Thorne's ammunition was running low. They had secured the scene, apprehended the Ares mercenaries, and treated Thorne not as a suspect, but as an asset who had held the line. Colonel Wyatt himself had arrived the next day. He had stood on this very porch, amidst the wreckage, and handed Thorne a set of official papers. Kaiser has been honorably discharged from service, he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. His final duty station is here, with you. It's what David would have wanted. A screen door creaked open behind them. Mary Ann stepped out, carrying a tray with sandwiches. She had been a constant presence since that night, first as a medic for Kaiser, then as a friend for Thorne, and now as something more. She had seen the warrior, and she had stayed for the man. Lunchtime, you two, she said, her smile as warm as the afternoon sun. Thorne looked at her, at the dog resting at his side, at the farm coming back to life around him. He had spent 2 years running from the world, trying to bury himself in his grief. But the world had found him, in the form of a broken dog. He had agreed to walk a dog for a day, and had ended up walking home with a partner. He had thought his mission was over, that his life had ended on that dusty road in Helmand. He was wrong. A new mission had found him. It wasn't about hunting men in the dark. It was about building a life in the light. It was about loyalty, honor, and finding a reason to live for the sunrise. Kaiser let out a soft woof and nudged his hand again. Thorne smiled, a real genuine smile that reached his eyes. He had saved the dog, but in the end it was the dog who had saved him. He was home. They were both home.